Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, 66 to 74 CE, by Guy Maclean Rogers, narrated by Perry Daniels. Publisher's Note: Appendices D, E, F, I, J, K, L, and O can be found in the print and ebook editions of this book. Introduction: A Small and Insignificant War. The Sacrifice of Birds. The fighting broke out in the spring of 66 CE over a sacrifice of some birds. Somewhere, perhaps in the northwest quarter of the Mediterranean harbor city of Caesarea, Jews had a synagogue that abutted land belonging to a Greek. The Jews had attempted to buy the Greek's property, offering him far more money than the plot was worth. In response, the Greek built workshops on the site. The workshops made access to the synagogue for Jews more difficult. Some of the younger Jews tried to halt construction of the workshops, but the Roman governor Florus intervened on behalf of the Greek. Some prominent Jews then gave Florus the enormous sum of 8 talents to get the Greek to desist. Florus took the money, went off to the city of Sebaste to the north of Judea, and let the work go on. The next day was the Sabbath. When the Jews were gathering around the synagogue, one of the non-Jewish Caesareans began sacrificing some birds on an upturned pot outside the synagogue. The sacrifice led to a confrontation between Jews and Caesareans. A local cavalry commander intervened, but to no avail. Some Jews who went to Florus in Sebaste to complain about the incident were arrested. News of what had happened in Caesarea was reported in Jerusalem. The reaction was muted at first. When Florus withdrew 17 talents from the temple treasury for imperial needs, however, protests broke out, and he was verbally abused by the crowd. After the leaders of the Jews did not surrender those who had mocked him, Florus let the troops under his command sack the upper agora of Jerusalem. More than 3,600 people were killed, including Jews who were members of the Roman equestrian order. The murdered Jews who belonged to that order were among the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire. There was a second massacre when Jews from the city went out to greet 2 more cavalry squadrons that were approaching Jerusalem from Caesarea. The soldiers pursued the terrified residents back into the city, killing those they encountered as the cavalrymen tried to reach the fortress called the Antonia, located at the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. The fortress was linked to the temple by porticos. Florus, too, was trying to make his way to the bastion, but his route was blocked by the enraged populace. After the population cut off access to the temple from the colonnades of the Antonia, Florus fled from the city, leaving behind one cohort of between 500 and 1,000 soldiers. When the fighting subsided, Cestius Gallus, the Roman governor of Syria, launched an investigation into what had happened in Jerusalem. The inquiry confirmed the loyalty of the people to Rome. At a gathering of the populace held within the area known as the Xystus, which lay between the palace of Judea's former Hasmonean rulers and the Temple Mount, the Jewish king Agrippa II, who had been king of Chalcis in what is now southern Lebanon since 50 CE, urged the Jews of Jerusalem not to start a war with Rome that they could not win, to rebuild the porticos that connected the Antonia fortress to the temple, and to pay the tribute owed to the Romans. At first the people heeded Agrippa's advice, but he was driven out of Jerusalem in a hail of stones after he urged the people to give obedience to Florus until a new Roman governor could be sent out. At that point, the temple captain Eleazar, son of the high priest Ananias, convinced the priests in charge of the temple services not to receive any more gifts or sacrifices from any foreigner. Such gifts or sacrifices might include those made by Romans, as well as ones offered by others on behalf of Rome and the emperor. Similar sacrifices had been made at the temple since the time of the Emperor Augustus. Putting an end to the sacrifices on behalf of Rome and the emperor was, in effect, a declaration of independence from Rome. The war of Jews against Romans that began in Caesarea in the late spring of 66 CE was symbolically declared by this refusal to let sacrifices for Rome and the emperor continue at the temple in Jerusalem. The conflict led to the destruction of the national site of sacrifice for the Jews, the beginning of a new imperial dynasty in Rome, and the Jews' loss of even nominal political independence for almost 1,900 years. When the unnamed Caesarion sacrificed some birds on an upturned pot next to the synagogue in Caesarea in 66, he bent the arc of history for Jews in the direction of unprecedented suffering, but finally back to the promised land of freedom. The costs of war. The fighting lasted for 8 years, and many of the Jews who gathered in the Xystus of Jerusalem to hear King Agrippa's speech in the spring of 66 did not survive the war. Villages and towns in the Galilee were destroyed by the Romans, and their inhabitants massacred or enslaved. A substantial number of Romans also died or were wounded. Over the better part of a decade, Romans killed Jews, and Jews killed Romans. Romans fought not only Jews but also each other after a Roman civil war broke out during the fighting in Judea. But Jews also slaughtered each other as they fought over the question of whether to seek peace with the Romans or to fight to the very end. The war of Jews against Romans almost immediately became a war of Jews against Jews, Jews against their neighbors, and according to Flavius Josephus, our main narrative source for the war, a war of Jews against their own God. God himself, Josephus believed, intervened directly in the fighting, taking the side of the Romans. In Jerusalem there occurred a civil war among 3 factions of Jews: widespread murder, a Roman siege, famine, cannibalism, combat of every kind, a conflagration, the destruction of the temple, a massacre of the civilian population, and the razing of large sections of the Holy City. Some who escaped from the Roman massacres in Jerusalem later committed murder or mass suicide, rather than be slaughtered by the Romans. Josephus implausibly claims that there were 1.1 million casualties in the war, most of them Jews. That figure is difficult, if not impossible, to accept, since recent studies estimate that the entire Jewish population of Palestine was approximately 600,000 at the time. Much more credibly, he also says that 97,000 were captured. Those who were not killed outright by the Romans during the fighting were used later as slave laborers on imperial work projects, or were made to fight each other or wild animals in the amphitheaters of Rome's provinces. Some of the leaders of the revolt were brought to Rome, where they marched in the triumphal procession of Rome's conquering generals in the summer of 71. Simon bar Giora, or son of Giora, who was perhaps the most effective rebel leader of the Jews during the war, was ritually executed in Rome at the end of the Romans' triumphal celebration of their victory. After the war was over, the Roman emperors appropriated the lands of Jews in Judea and imposed an unprecedented punitive tax upon all 1.2 million Jews living within the Roman Empire. Rome's new Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, also used the victory over the Jews to legitimate their claims to rule the empire. They saw to the building of monuments in Rome designed to memorialize their great triumph. Some of the treasures that the Romans looted from the temple in Jerusalem were displayed in buildings of the capital. Archaeological excavations in Rome have revealed that the Flavian dynasty erected in Rome not 1, but 2 monumental triumphal arches celebrating their victory over the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem. The famous Arch of Titus at the southeastern corner of the Roman Forum, and a larger, though less well-known triumphal arch that led into the Circus Maximus from the southeastern side. On a daily basis for centuries, these monuments and others reminded Romans and the large population of Jews living in Rome of the destruction of the Jewish temple and of a large part of Jerusalem. Most importantly, as we shall see, the Flavian amphitheater, or Colosseum, was financed at least in part from the spoils of the Roman victory over the Jews.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?